I would like to thank the Faculty of Classics here for this invitation to speak, and also thank James, Frisbee, Kofi, and Stephen for the collaborative project between Cambridge and Ghana that has made my visit possible. This is not my first time visiting the faculty, nor is it my first time making contact with the Faculty of Classics. In 2016, I was interviewed by James and Gabo for a place on your PhD program. I got admission, but without funding. There was no PhD program in classics in Ghana, and no PhD program with an ancient philosophy component in Africa. So for the first time in Ghana, we had a PhD program running from around 2018. But I was also desperate to get into the PhD program here. I applied for a Commonwealth scholarship through my institution. I was among 7 shortlisted candidates. The interview panel comprised professors from the business school, agricultural sciences, environmental science, and health sciences. The odds were against me, and I lost institutional nomination for the scholarship. At the interview, the professors failed to understand how the link I made between Platonic justice, equality, and the problems of leadership met a developmental need in Ghana, because their understanding of development was myopic. This is just one of the issues we encounter in our study and teaching of the classics in Sub-Saharan Africa. The second issue bodes the question of Africanization, one form of which suggests a total break from anything Western, and another form which proposes the recovery and development of African knowledge. For example, in his speech at the first international conference of the Classical Association of Ghana in 2018, the provost of the College of Humanities, Professor Samuel J. Mensah, remarked that I have one simple task for the Classical Association of Ghana. They should endeavor to extract the knowledge and values embedded in the African classical civilizations to make meaning of our contemporary life. In essence, they should Africanize the classics. This was not the first time he had made such remarks. In other fora, he had suggested an intentional inclusion of African civilizations in the teaching and curricula of the department as a way of decolonizing the classics, and of making the discipline relevant to contemporary issues in a way that students can identify with the field. Related to this, Kofi Aka, Associate Professor of Classics at the University of Ghana, made a remark during his presentation at a public panel I organized on the ways forward for classics in Africa. He said that Europeans and North Americans can afford to teach classics as part of their heritage. Third world countries struggling with existential needs have to justify teaching such programs. But I dare say that Europeans and North Americans can no longer just afford to teach the classics as part of their heritage, given the political, economic, and psychosocial imperatives for decolonization. And this is partly why the subject of decolonization needs to be covered now more than ever. In this lecture, I want to propose 3 things. 1, in decolonizing classics, we must advance the idea of a classics that is balanced, inclusive, and diverse in its approach to curriculum design, teaching, and research, what I refer to as the classics, a classics that has the concept of world civilization as its foundation. Consequently, 2, we should not limit classics to the civilizations and cultures of the ancient Greeks and Romans. And in our study of other civilizations, we should reject the hegemonic framework that considers other civilizations only from the lens of Greco-Roman civilizations. This means that decolonization must look beyond comparative and reception studies. 3, that the decolonization of classics is not a recent enterprise, and that both foreign and African classicists were involved in the collaborative work of decolonization, which can be replicated and developed for our modern study of the classics, in a way that puts the concept of world civilization that does not hegemonize one civilization of another as a framework. I explore these suggestions along with some challenges and reflections by relying on the work that has been carried out mainly in Ghana and Nigeria. Formal education in the Gold Coast, now Ghana, began around the 16th century when European settlers educated school pupils in the castles. Among these castle schools were those operated by the Dutch at Elmina, formerly held by the Portuguese, the British at Cape Coast Castle, and the Danes at Christiansborg, Accra. While most students educated in these castles were biracial, it was only from around the 18th century that children of wealthy merchants and most important local chiefs began receiving education in the castles. Formal education began to devolve, however, to the ordinary person when missionaries arrived and began establishing schools. Among the subjects was the teaching of Greek and Latin. which was to enable Africans read the Bible in the original languages. But as formal education developed under colonial administration of the British in the Gold Coast, Greek and Latin featured mostly at the secondary and post-secondary level as part of the general education of the individual. For example, the prospectus of the Wesleyan High School in Cape Coast, dated 19 March 1876, featured the following subject combinations. However, classics was available only in the elite secondary schools, so only a privileged few who attended secondary schools like Achimota, Infantipim, Adisadel, Accra Academy, Presbyterian Boys, Opukwari, St. Augustine, St. Francis Xavier, Tamale, Maoli, Pope John's, and St. Peter's had access to the classics. When the University of Ghana was established in 1948, classics became one of the founding disciplines. By this time, there had been growing nationalism and increased discontent with colonial rule, not only in Ghana, but across the sub-region. The result was a turn towards Pan-Africanism and Africanization. By the mid-1960s, at the height of African independence from colonial rule, the establishment of new classics departments had either come to an end or declined. Take the case of Ghana and many other countries south of the Sahara, where the establishment of new classics departments ceased with growing nationalism and full self-rule. All the classics departments were established before 1965, as you can see on the screen. This growing nationalism, leading to a major decline in classical studies, was also tied to the idea that expatriates, who were normally in the majority of qualified classics teachers, would not be able to Africanize the curriculum. Indeed, in 1961, leaders of ancient African states convened in Addis Ababa to deliberate on the development of education in Africa. And the consensus was that the colonial systems of education did not serve African interests. African leaders sought to bring that colonial goal to an end. In places where the discipline continued to be taught, it was because of the belief that it could be retooled to arm the African with knowledge about his or her heritage. A new policy of Africanization had taken over, envisioned in what Mazulu describes as producing an African university that had to reflect an African character, not only in terms of the student population, but also in terms of its administrative and teaching staff, the curriculum, syllabus, and the method of teaching and research. The achievement of Africanization or decolonization through formal education had its own challenges. The required local expertise was absent, and expatriates continued to remain in the universities. While in some African countries, it was presumed that the presence of expatriates gave foreign interests access to exploit the resources of African nations, other African nations grapple with the question whether foreign teachers would be able to Africanize the curriculum. Some of the views shared by African leaders were of a total break from anything Western, while others opined that adapting some of the values of the West would ensure that high academic standards were maintained. A prominent figure in this agenda for Africanization was Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana. Nkrumah believed that colonialism and imperialism were foundational reasons for the underdevelopment of African states and sought to project political independence as a means of emancipating the people, both in thought and action. He prioritized an African agenda for the unity of African states, not only for their political independence, but also for the economic and social independence. This included an agenda for the Africanization of the public service, which was to be achieved through formal education that sought, in quotes, an African view to the problems of Africa, unquote, and the replacement of Western-centered knowledge in the curriculum with an African-centered one. He thus initiated a process for reclaiming knowledge of Africa by inviting Africanist scholars to rewrite Africa's history. And as it states in his justification for such a project, an important aspect of Pan-Africanism is the removal and development of the African personality, temporarily submerged during the colonial period. The myth that Africa's history began with the arrival of the European and that Africans had achieved nothing and had no culture before them serves the purpose of imperialists who find it necessary to fabricate some kind of justification for capitalist exploitation. We therefore have that imperative politically and psychosocially to decolonize in Africa. Nkrumah's approach was not to inculcate what was relevant, and beneficial from the West, but not at the expense of his Africanization agenda. He was himself schooled in and had a fine appreciation of the classics. He had a good grasp of the history of Western philosophy and even referenced Aristotle to justify his motion for independence from British rule. Hence, for him, there was no question of rejecting everything Western. His focus was to decolonize the African mind by reclaiming and projecting African knowledge systems. The project of Africanization required deconstructing the racially jaundiced Eurocentric narratives and replacing them with critically and contextually grounded alternatives that reflect both the true history and civilization of the African peoples and the African personality. As the University of Ghana was a key public institution through which this Africanization agenda will be pursued, Nkrumah advocated for the University College of Ghana to become autonomous. Discussions had already been ongoing prior to Ghana's independence and during the tenure of the first principal of the university, David Mowbray-Barnes, a British classicist and Aristotelian scholar. In 1960, while Raymond Henry Stoughton was principal, the University College began the process of weaning itself from the University of London, with which it had a special relationship in terms of teaching for the external degree examinations. The goal henceforth was to make the University College of Ghana autonomous, awarding its own degrees with a stress on the need to Africanize the institution. Thus, by an act of parliament in 1961, the University of Ghana was established. One of the products of this move was the adoption of a new logo. The old logo was replaced with the Adinkra symbols, Aya, as the fan symbolizing truthfulness, and Junima and Tuaso, interlocking ram's horns, representing strength and integrity, with a Latin motto rendered by Alexander Popon, Integri Procedamus. These activities represented the first steps at decolonizing education at the tertiary level. As a field steeped in Eurocentrism and with a colonial history, it may seem counterproductive and contrary to the goals of Africanization for Kwame Nkrumah to appoint Colonel Chris O'Brien, a classicist and a foreigner, to head the University of Ghana in 1962. But Nkrumah had faith in the orientation of O'Brien as an anti-imperialist and was confident that O'Brien would provide the leadership needed for the university to achieve the goal of Africanization. That is to, quote, promote scholarship and research into Africa's history, culture, thoughts, and resources, unquote, and by implication show that Europe could not lay claim to any uniquely superior heritage. In a 1964 speech by O'Brien, he stated clearly to those who feared an infiltration of colonialism and neocolonialism to university education that the values to which we adhere have nothing in common with colonialism or with any other system of oppression, nor have they anything in common with neocolonialism or any other system of deceit. In this speech, O'Brien showed that there was a lot of things common to civilizations and that there is no point in making the case that Europe, for example, had a superior heritage or superior civilization over other civilizations. These thoughts shared by O'Brien are in sharp contrast to what many African leaders and educators feared would be a challenge for Africanization to be achieved in university curriculum if expatriates were allowed to remain in the universities. They not only drove O'Brien's leadership of the university, but also corroborated Nkrumah's approach, which was to bring together both local and foreign expertise as long as they were committed and or had shown commitment to the project of Africanization. In Nigeria, Nnamdi Azikiwe, the first president of Nigeria, adopted a slightly different approach. When he founded the University of Nsukka in 1955, he did not see the need to establish a classics department in the new university. Until date, only the University of Ibadan hosts a classics department in the whole of Nigeria, a country of a population of 213 million people and 91 public universities, at least 10 of which were established before 1980. And strangely, at the time of the establishment of the University of Nigeria in Nsukka, where African music, African history, journalism, and linguistics were taught, these weren't available as options at the University of Ibadan. Nnamdi Azikiwe pursued a policy of Renaissance Africa. In his book, Renaissance Africa, published in 1968, he offers 5 principles: spiritual balance, social regeneration, economic determinism, mental emancipation, and national risorgimento, for the realization of a new Africa with a view to the renaissance of Africans and for reformation of African society. That the effects of the colonial ambition of Europe for territorial expansion in Africa and the ascendancy of neocolonialism were very visible, meant that the African had to rediscover his identity, self-worth, and charge towards a new Africa, not in terms of geographical boundaries, but in a psychosocial sense. These principles influence Nnamdi Azikiwe's approach to education in Nigeria. And his principle of mental emancipation, which applied the most to the education of the African, he remarked as follows, that mental emancipation includes education of the sort which should teach African youth to have faith in his ability to believe that he is the equal of the people of other races of mankind, mentally and physically, to look at no man as a superior simply because that man comes from the Antarctic or Arctic regions. It means that the renascent African must be rid of inferiority complex. He further says that the African should relish with the rest of the world that while Oxford and Cambridge were in their inquest stages, the University of Sankore in Timbuktu welcomed scholars and learned from all over the Muslim world. The Renaissance African will be better off with men and women who are trained to appreciate these facts of African history than with those who spend a lifetime in Europe or America for purposes of miseducation and evaluation of African culture and civilization. First, we get a sense here why classics would not be an option for Nnamdi Azikiwe. The implied claim here is that colonial education had damaged the personality of the African, and this needed to be corrected by a counter-education that focused on a regeneration of the African spirit and the Africa's ability to contribute to civilization. Colonial education had erased or intentionally excluded the contribution of African civilizations and had projected a relationship of superiority over them, producing narratives that hegemonized Greco-Roman culture and civilization, touting them as the roots of Western modernity, and thereby projecting them as preeminent and worthy of study by all who want to be civilized. Thus, the mastery of Greek and Latin languages became the demonstrable standard of intellectual excellence and educated refinement. But what is classics or classical? Who defines what classics is? In whom is that agency vested? Are the languages of African civilizations or of Chinese or Indian civilizations excluded in what can be defined as the classics? For Nnamdi Azikiwe, such a conception of the classics that excludes equally important civilizations would not serve the goals of African Renaissance. Secondly, Nnamdi points us to the issue of agency in the decolonization of knowledge. Decolonization cannot be successful without human agency, and not just human agency, but one which understands and is committed to the imperatives of such an enterprise. This means that those who taught in African universities and were mostly trained in Europe and America needed to wean themselves off from the colonial mentality and embrace this new Africa. This meant for African scholars researching and introducing to the curriculum knowledge that advanced this kind of agency. For classicists in Ghana and Nigeria, these political, economic, and psychosocial imperatives for decolonization posed a huge challenge. And as they were directly linked to one of the disciplines that was complicit in the subjugation of the African people, and one in which the tools and skills for recovering Africa's past were most available, there was the need to pursue new directions. D.J.O. McQueen has called these new directions the transvaluation of the classics in Africa, which came in the form of comparative studies, reception studies, joint honors programs, publication of classics textbooks by Africans for easy access by African students. When the University of Ghana was established, the teaching staff were mainly expatriates, and this was mirrored in the constitution of the classics department, which had only one African, Lawrence Owosu-Appiah, on its faculty. I have already mentioned that there were fears expatriates would not commit to the goals of Africanization, and that it was perceived that the field of classics itself offered no potential for such an agenda to be achieved. So the Department of Classics at the University of Ghana had a great task of showing that it was committed to this agenda if it were to survive. And its faculty pursued Africanization in such a way that the contributions of Africans were highlighted and no one civilization was emphasized over the other. One of the early projects of Africanization to reclaim the history of Africa was the commissioning of Encyclopedia Africana, which was to publish a series of volumes on the history and cultures of Africa. That the first edition of this volume, which focused on Ghana and Ethiopia, was edited by the classicist Lawrence Owosu-Appiah, points towards a commitment to the goal of Africanization itself, and shows that those trained in the classics, whether abroad or in Africa, contrary to Nnamdi Azikiwe's fears, could execute the project. It also showed that classics, the very discipline that had contributed to the colonization of knowledge, had the tools that could be used to correct its mistakes. There wouldn't be the need to close down a classics department or cease establishing new ones if the discipline undergoes a reorientation that meets the goals of decolonization on all fronts. The Encyclopedia Africanist Project's founding director, W.E.B. Du Bois, described its purpose as follows. Now, in this purpose, we see a reflection of Nkrumah's goal for Africanization, as well as the non-retaliatory tactics adopted by both intellectuals. That this is not a matter of propaganda. The goal of the project was not to serve propagandist purposes in retaliation for the harm caused by colonialism, but to show the true knowledge of Africa and its people. By 1953, Alexander Kwapon had joined Lawrence Yavusuapia on the Classics faculty at the University of Ghana, where he continued working on his Cambridge PhD dissertation. The dissertation itself, titled Apelides and Autochthonies, a survey of the relations between the immigrants and the Libyans of North Africa, 631 to 111 BC, also reflects well the need to produce knowledge about Africa and to rewrite its history. Barbara Goff has explored Kwapon's own contributions in this regard, emphasizing, among other things, that his, quote, thesis works to put Africans at the center of the story of Greek colonization in Africa, while also insisting on positive interpretations of that story, unquote. But the crucial moments of Kwapon's contributions to the goal of Africanization were during his chairmanship of the Education Review Committee and his vice-chancellorship of the University of Ghana. The former role followed the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah's government by the National Liberation Council on 12 February 1966. The coup did not bring the Africanization agenda to an end, even though the conditions tied to the grants provided by the IMF and the US government favored the capitalist market. The coup did lead to reforms in education through an agenda for national reconstruction. But these reforms had little negative impact, if any, on the presence of classics in secondary and tertiary education. The Education Review Committee that was set up after the coup and chaired by Kwapon was tasked to review Ghana's educational system from basic through to tertiary levels and make recommendations that will lay the foundation for educational reforms in the country. According to Kwapon, the committee laid the highest priority on the middle level of the educational system as a key to strengthening the system as a whole and producing the needed manpower for technical, vocational teacher training and the higher education sector. The committee also placed emphasis on the learning of foreign languages, pointing out its relevance to literature and general education. Every pupil was required, therefore, to learn a classical language, example Latin, a modern foreign language, preferably French, and a Ghanaian language. The cooperation of classes in Ghana with the Africanization agenda is further seen in a congratulatory letter D.J.O.H. McQueen, a Canadian classicist who was teaching at the University of Ghana, sent to His Eminence George Cardinal Flahif. He reported that there were only 5 who were doing the challenging work of decolonization within the department, with 62 students. He continues, one of your distinguished colleagues from Upper Volta, that is present-day Burkina Faso, expressed the matter both tersely and eloquently when at the recent meeting of the African hierarchy at Kampala, he told the assembled fathers that they must stop thinking in European terms and devote themselves to the quest of the African soil. Our task is surely analogous, and with St. Augustine as my partner, I hope to play my part in the transvaluation of classical studies in Ghana. Like today, the work of decolonization was a very challenging one for classics in Sub-Saharan Africa, not only because of the political agenda for Africanization, but also because of the crisis of the humanities. In many cases, the latter has resulted in departmental mergers or closures, budget cuts, retrenchment of staff, and weakened efforts at reinvigorating classical studies. It is not clear whether McQueen would have been willing to commit to the Africanization agenda if these circumstances did not threaten the existence of the classics. However, when he did participate in the transvaluation of the field, he showed commitment to the project. He was involved in public engagement through hosting on national radio a program that connected the classics to African civilizations and explored various themes of relevance to the African continent. And he was also secretary to the Classical Association of Ghana. In addition to the association's work, faculty continued to engage the public through publishing, serving on committees nationally and internationally, and giving public lectures. Their publications and long essays written by students during this period also connected well with the African experience by focusing largely on comparative history and literature. To achieve this transvaluation McQueen speaks of, classicists in West Africa adopted and continue to adopt three main approaches. One approach looks beyond ancient Greece and Rome to consider their contact with Africa and its indirect implications for Sub-Saharan Africa. The second approach connects the ancient world to the African experience through a comparative and interdisciplinary method. And a third approach considers ways to make textbooks or translated works available to African students, where those written by non-Africans would not normally be available to them or fits within the African academic context. The first approach, one which sees civilization as not limited to ancient Greece and Rome, but goes beyond these to reclaim knowledge of ancient Africa and its achievements, is seen in the publication and reading of papers focusing on ancient North and East Africa. One of such publications was the second volume of Museum Africum, the West African Journal of Classical and Related Studies, published by the West African Classical Association, and which included papers by both African and foreign classicists covering topics on social change, health, mortality, and their own Deccan Primi in Roman North Africa. Before this, in 1969, Lloyd Arthur Thompson and John Ferguson had edited a book titled Africa in Classical Antiquity, 9 Studies, which contained contributions from scholars in Ghana, Nigeria, and the United Kingdom. In the foreword to the book, the editors explained that this volume of papers reflects one of the central interests of the Ibadan University Department of Classics. It is natural that in Africa, we should study ancient Africa. The field is fascinating, the opportunity vast, and work in English scanty. The papers here included are intended partly as a contribution to scholarship, which we hope will be of general interest to classicists and Africanists alike, and partly for the benefit of our own students who, except for the very few with a reading knowledge of French, depend entirely on the spoken word for stimulation in this field. The second approach adopts a comparative and interdisciplinary study of Greco-Roman and African cultures, showing the connections between them. For example, several classics long essays and master's theses and faculty publications produced over the years adopt this approach. The University of Ibadan in Nigeria is particularly strong in this through its comparison of Greco-Roman and Yoruba culture. So if you look at the long essays, you see the comparative studies very pronounced here. And this has been ongoing since the 1960s. You have some long essays here written in the 70s. Then at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria, scholars like Olakumbi Olasope, and Olaki Onayemi also adopt this particular approach. In an essay reflecting on 50 years of classical studies at the Open University, Hardwick describes Ferguson, John Ferguson, as, quote, a liberal scholar who in many ways was ahead of his time, especially in his determination that classical studies should be open to all and that it had a big part to play in dialogue with other subject areas. And here we're referring to the Yoruba culture. He had a strongly internationalist outlook, insisting that the arts faculty's inaugural first level course, which started in 1971, included the study of Yoruba history and culture, unquote. Indeed, this outlook of classical studies and the experience he gained from teaching at the University of Ibadan informed the direction of his leadership at the Open University. This approach has been beneficial in student retention as it enables students to connect classical culture to their own cultures. It has also driven interest in the discipline from non-classicists. The third approach is one major strength of the classics department at the University of Ghana. This has to do with the translation of original works and preparation of textbooks on Greco-Roman history, literature, and philosophy that identifies with the peculiar needs of African students and has been carried out successfully by Lawrence Ofosu-Appiah and Kofi Aka. The goal is to make classical literature accessible to students who would normally have no knowledge of Greek and Latin. In this regard, Lawrence Ofosu-Appiah, the first Black African to study classics at Oxford, and the first African to be appointed to the classics department at the then University College of the Gold Coast, now University of Ghana, translated Homer's Odyssey, books 8 to 12, and Plato's Apology into 3. The import of this exercise is clear. To translate these texts into the language of one of the most widely spoken in Ghana means that not only those who have studied Greek and Latin, in those days the elite, would have access to classics. Some of the textbooks I mentioned also connect ancient cultures to the contemporary world. Key texts that have been produced as part of this approach are Civilizations of Antiquity and An Introduction to Ancient Greece, with reflections on its import for developing societies, which were introduced to accompany first and second year courses respectively due to changes in curriculum. There is currently a revival of Africanization through comparative and reception studies in West Africa. But these would have no major impact until the present curriculum that we have is subjected to a revision that takes into consideration the concept of world civilization that defined the kind of classics pursued in the early post-independent period. We are no longer in an Nkrumah era where classics, a field of study known to have a history of colonialism, elitism, and racism, has to justify its presence in university education. But there are still other factors such as growing Pan-Africanism, the unending crisis in the humanities, and the demand for relevance to African context that continue to threaten the field's survival. The post-independent era saw a sustained attempt to show that the classes had been wrongly used as a tool for oppression, and that the values that define the discipline were shared values, not uniquely European. It is this sense of world civilization which gave no prominence to any one civilization, but emphasized the shared connections African civilizations had with other civilizations that sustained the classics in West Africa during the periods of educational reforms based on Africanization and national reconstruction. We are aware of the negative connotations that arise whenever classics is mentioned in certain corners, and attempts have been made to correct these. But in Ghana, despite the discipline being in its 7th decade, classics remains foreign to academics, some academics, and students who are outside of the discipline. This issue is also central to the problems of student retention and curriculum development, and they influence the interdisciplinary and comparative approaches to classics research in West Africa. But as I've mentioned earlier, these connections are more pronounced in research carried out than in the curriculum taught to our students. So when you consider, for example, the BA program at the University of Ghana, you realize that this is very much pronounced. Civilizations of the ancient world, philosophical questions, problems of philosophy, outlines of Greco-Roman literatures, outlines of Greco-Roman civilizations, pre-Socratic philosophy, Socratic philosophy, Greek epic and drama, Roman epic and drama, the philosophy of Plato, Roman philosophy and science, Greek literature and society, Roman literature and society. These are core courses in the program, nothing on Africa. African students and African universities are searching for those things that identify with African predicaments. And on this premise, we can do something about our curriculum. While in our research and in our teaching, the Africanization agenda is incorporated, this does not reflect pronouncedly in the curriculum that we have. It's the same thing with the curriculum at the University of Ibadan. When you take the curriculum, there's so much emphasis on the ancient languages, for example. And that makes the curriculum a Eurocentric curriculum. Therefore, a move towards a curriculum that does not limit itself to just Greece and Rome will not be uniform across departments, and so will depend on specific contexts. For Ghana and Nigeria in particular, this means a lot of things like training faculty at partner universities through staff mobility programs so they can acquire the requisite knowledge to develop and teach new courses in areas where they lack expertise. It also means inviting experts, both Africans and non-Africans, in different fields of classical studies to contribute to such an initiative. And the collaboration between Cambridge and Ghana is in the right direction. Collaboration between the classics departments in Africa and with those abroad, where such initiatives have been implemented would help. If necessary, a quadrennial meeting of African classes departments could be held to reflect on the growth of the discipline within the continent and put up measures to meet present challenges. A key need will be funding for initiating and executing these proposals, but I do not think that this will be difficult to secure. The idea sits very well with our universities, and it will serve as a good example to classes departments in other parts of the world on what it means to conceive of classes as belonging to world civilizations, including those of Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Are you happy to take some questions?
Yeah.
So just before we all adjourn, if there are any questions now, this is a good opportunity to pose them. Yes, Cecily.
Hi, thank you for this. It's really fascinating. I wanted to ask a bit more about access, like open access and stuff to materials in African universities. Is that like part of the kind of decolonizing impetus? Because it seems like something that Western universities like Cambridge and Cambridge University Press could do as a kind of like material thing to aid.
Yeah, I think that is a very important point, and that has been one of the challenges of gaining access to the classics. For example, if I had not come here, I wouldn't, for example, have access to the Cambridge series on the history of Africa. But I live in Africa. And if I had not come here, and I intend going to the library at Oxford University, I wouldn't have access to Lawrence Ofosu-Appiah's translations of Homer's Odyssey and Plato's Apology in my mother tongue. The language in which he translates these works, that is my mother tongue, but I cannot have access to them. So having access to these materials are very key and important. But there is also the economic problem especially with African universities. I recall some years back when our library at the University of Ghana, BAM Library, wanted to remove the old journals, classical journals, and some of the books from the shelves to create space for new books in other disciplines. So the value that we play, the value that university administrators place on our discipline also affects our access to these materials. So that even if there is money to access those materials or to subscribe to them, they don't think that it is important for Africa's development. And that also leads us to what our conception of development is. And it's not just in Africa, but also here in Europe and in America, because we conceive of development as something tangible. And so we place a lot of emphasis on subjects like economics, political science, law, and then relegate classics, archaeology to the background. But if we can change that conception of development, then we can have some headway as well when it comes to access.
I think it's all about, yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. Really enjoyed it. I guess a major question for anybody studying classics, it's impossible to separate your own subjective views and your background and your history from what you're studying and spending your time with every day. You mentioned kind of the implications of classics in the conceptions of imperialism and colonialism and racism just as a foundational thing. How do we kind of reconcile the very thing that kind of justifies or explains this kind of tainted legacy of Africa? How do we kind of reconcile that relationship with it also being the very thing that could be used as a tool to liberate and educate and diversity?
Yeah, I think this would be a collaborative work, as has been shown, especially with the approach that Kwame Nkrumah, for example, pursued, that the classics, though has been used as a tool for oppression, can also be used as a tool to correct the very mistakes that it has committed. And so, and that is one reason why it needs to be accessible, not just to a certain group of people, but to everyone. And so we need to implement approaches that make the classics widely accessible to everyone. That can begin, for example, from the question of whether everybody must study Greek and Latin languages, whether it's compulsory to study Greek and Latin languages, because there are other classical stuff that do not require, for instance, the study of Greek and Latin languages. And that is why we are saying that we also need to look at other civilizations. And in looking at those civilizations, we do not necessarily have to look at them from the gauge of Greco-Roman civilizations. What contributions have those civilizations themselves been able to make to culture and civilization? If we look at it that way, then we'll be able to reclaim the things that have been lost in our study of classics.
I mean, thank you so much. I just wanted to pick up on the question about, and one of the things I think you referred to with President Ghana and Nkrumah, I have the impression, please correct me if I'm wrong about this, that he presents classics as if it's been misused by colonial educators. There's nothing inherently imperialist, racist about the study of this discipline. In fact, he argues, if I've understood conscientism properly, that if we go back to the living roots of Greek philosophy, we see these egalitarian, communalist, humanist values. So as a discipline, is that not one way that he tries, in a sense, to answer Hannah's question by saying, it's this horrific historical accident that they were used in this way. But if you really read the text properly, as he tries to do in that wonderful work, then you see that the subject itself reads very different and should never have been used that way. To a large extent, and that is why we still go back to the issue of agency. I mean, who interprets these texts? Should Africans be allowed to interpret these texts as well? And if they do, what kind of results come up? Remember at our conference recently, where I presented on Plato's Republic using an Afro-Communitarian perspective, we see some differences in the interpretation or the kind of reflections that arise out of the text. So the issue of agency is important, and that is why it is necessary. When people ask for instance, but why should you study classics in an African university, or why should an African study classics? This is one reason. It's an issue of agency. I need to take the classics and do what I can with it within the context and framework in which I live, and not just rely on what someone else or how someone else has interpreted these texts. So yes, to some extent, this is one way that we can correct these mistakes.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Shushma.
Thank you so much for being really fascinating. I was struck by your list of the curriculum in undergraduate level and the way that it, the kind of things it focused on. I was wondering whether there was any kind of push or any discussion, I suppose, in your university or in others about integrating, for example, Roman North Africa in an African cultural studies course which hopefully would then start to help reframing, seeing actually that period not as part of in the chronology of the Roman world, but to reframing in terms of seeing it within the chronology of African cultural studies, and whether that's something that you know you see as possible or desirable, I suppose.
Yeah, there have been discussions, but there have not been so much commitment to these discussions. I should mention that there are actually two elective courses, one on Greek North Africa, and then the other on Roman North Africa. But these are elective, and students can choose not to pursue it. But one positive thing is that the program is done in translation, and so students are not required to have knowledge of Greek and Latin. Everything is done in translation. But within the teaching itself, these are incorporated, even though the curriculum does not show, but in the teaching itself, these are incorporated. So for example, if in Greek epic and drama, they would definitely make references to adaptations of Greco-Roman literature and study them. But what I was saying is that it needs to be pronounced within the curriculum itself, so that there's a strong basis for studying the classics within an African context. And I'm hoping that in some years to come, this will be achieved.
Thank you. Yes.
I was just wondering, when you're talking about African classics, what you feel the role is of 19th century African thinkers who were interested in the ancient Near East and the classical world, like Samuel Johnson, for example, or other sort of 19th century European scholars. Does that fit with the trajectory that you draw of kind of African classicists in the nationalist and post-colonial era? Would you regard that as a very certain body?
If you could shed light on some of the thoughts of these persons you mentioned.
Yeah, so for example, in 19th century thinkers like Samuel Johnson, who were interested in creating a genealogy or an originary story of European identity in the ancient Near East, for example, they have interests in the classical period and in ancient Middle Eastern history. Does that fit in any way with the academic study of classics and the academy in the nationalist and post-colonial periods?
Yeah, I think that is that was the orientation of the post-colonial leaders, that it's the exercise in reclaiming, for example, African civilizations. It's not an exercise in retaliation, but an exercise in bringing all these civilizations to the limelight to show that they are important, equally important. And so if you are building a field of classics, then the focus should not just be on one particular civilization, but should spread around these other civilizations. So it's not even just African civilization, but also the ones you mentioned, Indians, Chinese, including the languages. These are important. These are crucial for development.